Okay, if we could ask you to find your seats, we'd like to go ahead and get started. Just 2 minutes. Oh, that was quick. They're very polite here. Okay, welcome. My name's Gene Tracy. I'm the director of the Center for the Liberal Arts. This is the third and final Call 300 event in the visitor series for the fall 2017. So my job is just to kind of contextualize tonight's event and then get out of the way. So as the slides behind me that have been running through, and this one in particular articulate, Call 300 aims to lift us out of our familiar surroundings. So the on-campus courses that are associated with these events are part of the new curriculum, and they're aligned each semester with our what we call the Call 300 theme. And the theme this semester is inclusion and exclusion. And so we ask each of our Call 300 visitors to share of themselves, not just what they know of what they've learned, but how to talk about their lives, to engage with our students and faculty during a more extended visit, not just an evening event. And it's in that way that the visit gets integrated into the courses and in a meaningful way. So our guest tonight is Professor Sarah Deer. She's a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation, a MacArthur Award-winning scholar, advocate for survivors of sexual and gender-based violence in Native American communities. Now, we're deeply honored to have Professor Deer with us this week. My colleague, Professor Lange Holtz, will do a much more complete introduction of Professor Deer in a moment. Now tonight, as we've done in the past, we'll take both written and oral questions from the floor. So if hopefully we're given a little card. If you want to submit a written question, please use one of the cards. We'll come around and collect them at the appropriate time. You can just hold them up and wave them. We'll have runners. And they'll bring you a microphone if you want to ask your question orally. Now, we know tonight's discussion topic covers some very sensitive material that may be upsetting to some of our community members. So please be sure to take care of yourselves during the presentation and after. Please know that Liz Gascon, the director of the Haven, is here to speak with anyone who needs support. Liz is seated by the door upstairs, there waving her hand, if you see her in the back there. Okay, thank you, Liz. I'd also like to thank Ben Boone, Sharon Morris, John Lombardini, and Kara Thompson for their help in making this event a success. We invite all of you to join us at the reception following the main event. It's in Chesapeake A this time. Usually it's right out the back, Tidewater, but this time it's Chesapeake A, up the stairs, down the end of the hall that way. Okay, and so you'll have a chance to interact with our guests more directly. We'll also have a few copies of Professor Deer's book, The Beginning and the End of Rape, available as well, if you want to do more reading on this. So let me introduce Dr. Ashley Atkins Spivey. Dr. Spivey has a PhD in anthropology from William & Mary. She's chair of and director of the Pamunkey Indian Tribal Resource Center. She's chair of the Virginia Board of Historic Resources, the director of the Pamunkey Indian Museum and Cultural Center. I'd like to ask Dr. Spivey, who's also the newly appointed tribal liaison for the College of William & Mary, to welcome Professor Deer on behalf of Virginia's Native peoples. Thank you, Ashley.
I have a lot of gifts, sorry. Thank you, Professor Tracy, for that introduction. So this afternoon, I'm here in my capacity as both the tribal liaison for the College of William & Mary and our new academic initiative, the Interdisciplinary Native Studies program here at the college. One of my preeminent responsibilities as tribal liaison and following our established Native protocol is to welcome Indigenous visitors to our traditional homeland in friendship. The Pamunkey people called this region Suquamish, and our residents on our reservation, one of the oldest in the United States, I have to add, is a testament to our enduring history. This region of Virginia is home to numerous other tribes as well. Tonight we have Chief Lynette Austin of the Nottoway Tribe of Virginia in the audience. Chief Austin, please stand so that we can acknowledge you and all of the work that you do for our communities. Thank you. We also have representatives from the Cherenhaka Nottoway tribe, the Tally family specifically. If you are in the audience, please stand or wave so that we can also acknowledge you. Nobody's here. They're coming. If there are any other tribal members in the audience, please stand or raise your hand so that you may be acknowledged as well. Okay. Thank you. Professor Deere, on behalf of Virginia's Native people, the Native students of the College of William & Mary, and the Native Studies minor, I welcome you, and I'd like to present you with a couple of gifts from my tribal community, the Pamunkey. So the first thing that we have is a piece of pottery made from one of our traditional potters, Mildred Moore. She's in her 80s. She is one of the oldest women on the reservation who is still making pottery. It's one of our oldest traditions, and I would like to honor you with that gift.
Thank you.
And I'll pack everything up for you
Sure.
afterwards. I'd also like to honor you with one of our sacred feathers, and that's from the turkey. This is a turkey tail feather, and it's wrapped with leather and wampum. And we want to present this with you to honor you for the work that you are doing for Indian country and for Native women. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right.
Yes.
Yes. And now I would like to welcome to the stage Professor Danielle Moretti Holtz, Director of the American Indian Resource Center and the Native Studies minor program. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashley. Good evening. Nice to see you here this evening. A short distance from where you are sitting is Jamestown, the archaeological site of the first permanent English-speaking settlement in North America. The celebrity cast of historical figures associated with that colonial enterprise include a Powhatan woman known to us as Pocahontas. This year marks the 400th anniversary of the death of Pocahontas, and conferences in England and museum exhibits on both sides of the Atlantic attempt to disentangle the complicated ropes that bind Pocahontas to our received settler colonialist narratives. The cartoon image of her is seared in our minds, along with talking trees and cuddly furry friends. We learn that Pocahontas' story is about love, not loss. It's about saving colonists, not losing sovereignty. This evening, we are fortunate to have a Native legal scholar of note to help us reframe our understanding of the realities of Native women's lives in the post-colonial world. Unlike the cartoon images of American Indian women that are featured in settler colonial narratives, Professor Deere's work forces us to face the intractable problem of sexual and domestic violence in Indian country. Her scholarship focuses on the intersection of federal Indian law and victims' rights. Professor Deere is a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation of Oklahoma. She received her BA and JD with tribal certificate from the University of Kansas, and she is currently a professor at the University of Kansas. She's a recipient of a 2014 MacArthur Fellowship and Kansas University Law School's first Langston Hughes appointment. Sarah Deere's work on violence against Native women has received national acclaim. She served as a primary consultant for Amnesty International's Maze of Injustice campaign, and she is the co-author of 3 textbooks on tribal law, and her latest book is The Beginning and End of Rape, as was mentioned, Confronting Sexual Violence in Native America. And I know that we've had a group of faculty reading this book, led by Claire McKinney. Most importantly, Sarah Deere's scholarship, teaching, and activism has been and is a force for change. Her work facilitated the passage of important legislation, landmark legislation, the Tribal Law and Order Act of 2010 and the 2013 Reauthorization of Violence Against Women Act. We are honored to have you with us. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Deer.
Thank you. I'm already overwhelmed. What a great reception and an invitation and introduction. I'm very humbled. And I do want to, again, acknowledge the traditional indigenous people of this land. Their absence makes our presence possible, and we need to acknowledge that at all times. I know that it took a lot of folks behind the scenes working to get me here, and so I don't know all of your names, but I know that there was a lot of work that went into arranging my visit, and so thank you to everyone who had a part in that and made it possible for me to be here. I also want to acknowledge Professor Jack Martin, because he is our linguist for my tribe, has helped us preserve our Muskogee language in dictionary form, as well as capturing some of our traditional stories, and the immense amount of work that you've done to help us save our language is deeply appreciated. Thank you for that. With that said, I am going to be embarking on just a few minutes of discussion here about the work that I've been doing on sexual violence in Indian country, and a little bit about my book, The Beginning and End of Rape. Every time I talk about sexual violence, I have to remember that there are probably multiple people in this room who have been directly affected by the crime, whether as a victim yourself or a close friend or family member. And even if it's been years, even if it's been decades, it can be difficult to hear about this information. Maybe you've been okay for many years, and suddenly something I say brings up some difficult material for you. And so I just want to tell you to take care of yourself and to honor your story and your wisdom about what you need to do in this space. It's not easy. I talk about sexual violence every day, and so sometimes I think it's an easy thing to do because I do it as a profession, but there are days when it becomes really difficult, and there are days where I need my own space. So please give that to yourself as you're listening. I won't be talking about anything particularly graphic in terms of descriptions of assaults or any images of assaults. Nonetheless, I know it can be difficult material to hear. I want to start with some bad news, but I promise that my entire presentation will not be depressing. In fact, I think by the end, we'll have a lot to celebrate together and a lot of things to be very proud of. The progress that has been made on this issue is incredibly inspiring to me, and so I hope to share some of that inspiration with you. So bear with me as I get through some difficult material first. And that is just simply that we need to tell very honest and difficult truths. And that involves statistics about the rates of sexual violence and gender-based violence committed against Native women in this country. There's no doubt, if you look at the federal data, the Department of Justice issues a series of reports about crime and victimization, sexual violence, and there's really no question that Native women experience the highest rate of violence in the United States by far. The most recent data that the Department of Justice released just last May of 2016 said that over 84.3% of Native women have experienced some form of violence. So that's nearly all of us. And one of the things that becomes very difficult for me when I do travel to reservations around the country is I talk to a lot of Native mothers and grandmothers and aunties about this crime. And so often I've heard some refrain of some version of this. I don't help my daughter think about what she should do if she's raped. I help my daughter think about what to do when she's raped. Because so many of us see it as an inevitable part of our existence, and it has been that way for many, many, many centuries. So we think about rape as something that we can expect to happen, not something that we hope doesn't happen. When we look at the sexual violence in particular, we see over half of Native women have experienced some form of sexual violence. So, one of the things that I'm cautious about is sort of playing oppression Olympics. in the sense that we look at, who has it the worst and then sort of minimize the other harm that's being done. But I think there's something really profound about understanding that the indigenous people of this land are the most likely to be brutalized still today. And I think that that needs to be acknowledged as we try to solve the problem. We can't accept this rate of violence. It's simply, it's not sustainable if we are to continue to persist as indigenous people. One of the other really interesting parts of the data, and I'm not a statistician, I know enough to basically make mistakes when I talk about data, but I've tried really hard to understand data because I found that it's a very important tool that we use to make social change, right? If I just go to a senator and I say, most Native women have been sexually assaulted, and he says, well, how do you know that? But if I go and I say, the Justice Department says that 84.3% of Native women will be victims of violence, then he's willing to listen, he or she is willing to listen. One of the other really disturbing parts of thinking about violence against Native women in this country is the rate of interracial crime. And by that I mean perpetrators who are not Native. Now, in American jurisprudence, or American criminology rather, there's one constant, and that is that most victims of violent crime have a perpetrator who's a member of their same race. And that's pretty much a default across the board. So if you're a white victim of violence, your perpetrator is more likely than not to be white, and so on and so forth. The only exception to that rule is for Native women. Native women report that the vast majority of their perpetrators are non-Native. They're members of a different race, primarily white. This bar chart shows how that works. So on the left are the number of Native people who report that have been victimized by a non-Indian perpetrator, and the rate for female victims, Native victims, is 96%. So 96% of Native women who report that they have been victims of some form of violence report that their perpetrator was non-Native. In terms of Native victims, we certainly do experience violence at the hands of Native people as well, and we cannot erase that or deny that, but it is the minority of crimes that we experience at the hands of Native people. Now, this particular statistic is important for a couple of reasons. One is it really does suggest that the problem continues to be colonial, in the sense that it appears that Native women are targeted by people outside their race. But as a lawyer, I'm also interested in this question of jurisdiction, right? And what tribal courts can and cannot do to protect their own people. And one of the things that we cannot do is prosecute non-Indians. That is forbidden, with one exception that I'll talk about in a little bit. So if most of our perpetrators are non-Native and we're not allowed to prosecute them, that's a story that we need to tell, and we need to change that framework. So a little bit of good news. I don't believe that Native women have always experienced this high rate of violence. I don't think that civilizations can sustain themselves if 84% of women are being brutalized in some way. And so I don't think we would have been able to subsist or exist on this continent for as long as we've been here had we always had this very high rate of violence. Now, I don't believe that tribal cultures were rape-free or violence-free. Some have suggested such, that we didn't have any rape prior to contact. And I don't think that's accurate. I think that no culture is perfect, right? No society is perfect. And I'm not suggesting that indigenous cultures were better, but I think that one of the things that we see embedded within our culture and our language and our traditions is a different kind of respect for women that may not have been shared by our folks, our friends from Europe, right? Of course, women in the European context were property, more or less, property of first their fathers and then their husbands. And so that sort of facilitates, if you're property, you're not respected in the same way as if you're a human, right? And so that was really the European norm. We didn't have that concept of women as property in most of our indigenous cultures. And I say that, with some trepidation, because in a short presentation like this, I'm sort of lumping all tribes together, which is dangerous, right? Because there's so much variation among tribal nations. There's over 560 federally recognized tribes in this country and numerous state recognized tribes, right? And every one of them is different, and every one of them has a different story and a history and a culture. And so when you lump everyone together, it becomes dangerous, and that's what the legal system does, which is why it's so problematic. So I want to be cautious about how I share this information. But by and large, when we look at traditional belief systems, historical belief systems about gender, we don't see the same sort of hierarchy, right? Where men are here and women are here, right? Men here, women here. And it's not that we weren't gendered societies. We were. There were roles for women and roles for men, but they generally weren't categorized in a hierarchy. It was a sense of reciprocity, right? Where men did things and women did things, and sometimes there were exceptions to that. And we have two-spirit relatives, right? LGBTQ, two-spirit family members. And so we didn't have these strict gender roles, but by and large, women did certain things and men did certain things. But it wasn't a power dynamic necessarily, okay? So one of the things when I started studying this issue in law school was what my tribe, the Muskogee people, had traditionally done if there was a case of domestic violence or if there was a rape. What was the legal response to that? And unfortunately, I couldn't find very much when I went out to venture in the libraries, and I didn't have the financial resources to travel to Oklahoma to do this kind of research properly. So I was sort of stuck in the libraries in Kansas, and one of my professors suggested, because I was really struggling with this project, that it would be acceptable to look at some of the things perhaps Europeans or Americans said about Creek people. Most of the time you have to be really, really cautious with that kind of material because it has so much misinformation. It's couched in ethnocentricity, racism, very inaccurate sort of reports about Native people. But I went ahead and followed up with that idea, and I found the journals and the letters of William Bartram, who was an American naturalist. I think what he was doing in the southeastern part of the United States was, I think he was sort of categorizing plants and animals in the southeast. At any rate, he lived with and near Creek and Cherokee people during the time that he lived in the southeast. And he remarked upon our culture numerous times, both on his own terms and then in response to questions that he had from friends and acquaintances. And this was one of the things that he said. Thank you. I was supposed to get that, and I didn't. Is that he remarked about the interesting gender dynamics. And he said that, he had not seen this disrespect for women among Creek and Cherokee Indians. Now, one of the things, again, is you have to be a little careful. I think he was maybe very romanticizing our people and trying to make us sound like noble savages or something, a stereotype that can be as harmful as any. But again, I think that it was noteworthy to him to make this statement, to document this experience that he had as a culture in which women were not treated with disrespect, right? And that would again be contrasted to, at that time, the Anglo-American system, largely inherited from England, that treated women as property, and therefore abuse was more likely to be tolerated in that society. The other thing that I found in this early research as a law student was the first time that our people wrote down our laws in English, which was quite early. We were heavily assimilated and trying to survive as a result of federal encroachment. And one of the things that our Indian agent said to us is that we needed to have a civilized legal system. What does that mean? It means written laws in English, which our laws were passed down orally. Right? So writing down laws was not something that we did naturally, but that was impressed upon us that we needed to do that. And so we did. We assimilated our legal system. We wrote down our laws in English. We still, suffered mightily at the hands of the federal government despite assimilating. But this was interesting to me because the first time we wrote down a rape law was in 1824. Even though it was part of a major assimilation project, there's still a nugget there of potentially pre-colonial legal structures, right? So what's so interesting to me about this law is the last 6 words, what she say, it be law, which is a very different way of thinking about rape than the way the Anglo-American system had at that time, where typically, you had to have 3 witnesses, the woman had to report immediately, she was sort of at the mercy of a male-dominated legal system and certainly didn't have an independent voice, right? Here we have a law that suggests that the women who were victims had agency and leverage to actually make decisions within the legal system. And so that's something that's very inspiring to me, to think that we had a system that worked well enough that a white man thought we didn't even have domestic violence or sexual assault, and we had these systems in place that centered victims' voices. That at least, I don't know about the adjudication part of it, but at least the sentencing part of it was left to the victim, and I think that's a very powerful thing to think about. So I don't believe that our societies have always suffered from rates of violence exceeding 80%. I think that we had systems in place, I believe we had systems in place that prevented that level of violence from becoming embedded within our culture and our society. So what happened, right? How did we go from this kind of system to a system where almost every Native woman that you will ever meet will be a victim of violence, right? How did that happen? What's that story? And that's really what I've set out to do, devote my career to, is trying to tell that story. And that's what the book that I authored recently is trying to do as well. So in order to understand what happened, I think we have to understand what the conception of sovereignty is, right? Sovereignty sounds like a complicated legal term, and it's really not. All it really means is that you're a government, you have the right to govern yourselves, right? And we don't really have to think about it in other contexts, right? It's sort of taken for granted. The state of Virginia is a sovereign government. Right? Nobody ever really challenges that. The same thing with the federal government. The United States is a sovereign government. That means it can make laws and be governed by those laws. And we never really worry about it. It's sort of a given. It's sort of something we take for granted. But in the context of tribal nations, it's been under attack systemically for many, many centuries. And so when we talk about tribal sovereignty, we're talking about something that we're trying to hold on to, something that we're trying to protect and sustain so that we can govern ourselves, so that we can be recognized as nations, as governments that can handle our own affairs, right, internally. But I think sovereignty can also have sort of a metaphorical identity for us as individuals, right? I mean, we should be sovereign over our bodies. We should get to make all the decisions about what happens to our bodies, what happens to our relationships with other people. That should be within our control, right? But what happens in a sexual assault case is that control is taken away. And it's very similar in some ways to the kind of damage that's been done to tribal nations, where decisions, poor decisions, have been made about us and to us without our consent. And that's really the sort of metaphor that I'm trying to draw out here. So if we had effective systems, if we sort of take that and think tribes had effective systems that work to protect women and children from violence, what happened is that those systems have been weakened or dissolved by colonial control, particularly the American government. So there's a story there, and it's a long legal story that I cannot possibly tell you in the time that we have together. But I will say that there have been a series of laws and policies over the course of the last 200 plus years of American rule that have made it very, very difficult for tribes to take care of themselves. We have to get permission to take care of each other, right? To make sure that things don't happen that harm our own people. So there have been a series of laws and policies. I'm just going to talk about a couple here, because I'm talking about in the context of sexual violence. So I'm going to talk about the Indian Civil Rights Act first. This was a law passed by Congress and signed into law in 1968. And it sounds like a really great law, right? If you think about that time period and civil rights, right, there was some amazing social justice change, advocacy, activist work being going on at that same time. And this was at the same time, but this law was a little different, because what this law did is it demanded that tribal courts adhere to Western norms, right? So the Indian Civil Rights Act is not about necessarily the civil rights of Indians. it is about ensuring that tribes operate or act like Western court systems by imposing language from the American Constitution onto tribes. But more importantly, when we talk about violent crime, is the limitation that it imposed on tribal nations, and that is for sentencing authority. So the maximum penalty for any crime that a tribe prosecutes is 1 year incarceration. And that would be for murder, for rape, for child sex abuse, any of those major crimes that you can think of. We can only sentence those offenders to 1 year maximum. So when you think about a victim's perspective on that, that can be a very overwhelming thought, that if I come forward and I report this crime and he's prosecuted, the maximum amount of time that he's going to be removed from my community is 1 year. And that can be incredibly difficult to think about. Think about a case of murder, right? Maximum penalty 1 year. And then there was this Supreme Court case in 1978 called Olifant versus Suquamish Indian tribe. Not that long ago, 1978. And this Supreme Court case ruled that tribal nations could no longer prosecute non-Indians for any crime, no matter what it is, right? So now if you have a non-Indian who's on a reservation or on tribal trust land who commits an act of violence against a woman, man, child, doesn't matter, nothing can be prosecuted by the tribe. This flew in the face of decades and centuries of federal Indian law that said that Congress had to be explicit when they divested the tribe of jurisdiction. Here, the Supreme Court interpreted the history of the United States as being one that divested the tribes of authority in this situation. So if you recall the statistics I shared about interracial crime earlier, again, you see why that's an important factoid to remember. So by the end of the 20th century, tribal courts have been extremely limited. We can only prosecute Indians, and largely they have to be members of a federally recognized tribe. The maximum penalty that we've been able to impose is 1 year. And of course, it's very expensive to run a criminal justice system, and most tribes still suffer from crushing poverty. And so the ability to have a functioning contemporary criminal justice system is prohibited simply because of its expense. So when you think about that, it explains to some extent why there are so many victims. We don't have a system there to protect us. We don't have a system there to intervene and intercede and make sure that people are held accountable for their violent behavior. We don't have that luxury, right? So I think that explains the story a little bit. And of course, there's many other laws and policies we could talk about, but those are the two I thought would be most relevant to our discussion this evening. But all is not lost. Native women are not passive victims. What we need are allies and not pity. We need people to understand these issues and articulate these issues and take responsibility for these issues so that we're not the sole voices trying to make change. But we have made change, and this is why I wanted to end with these more inspirational stories. In 2010, President Obama signed the Tribal Law and Order Act, which was a package of legislation that contained numerous provisions. But the one I want to point out to you is that through this legislation, tribal nations have the option now of sentencing someone to up to 9 years rather than 1. It still seems arbitrary, right? But from a victim's perspective, that might make a huge amount of difference. So we were able to change, based on the statistics and the voices and our stories and our advocacy and our legal work, we were able to convince Congress to change that law, right? So that was a profound victory. We had a similar important victory in 2013 when President Obama signed the Violence Against Women Act. Remember Olifant, which took jurisdiction away for non-Indian offenders. We got a sliver of it back, just a sliver. Congress was willing to restore our authority over non-Indians, but only in cases of domestic violence. So the non-Indian perpetrator has to be in a relationship or have a former relationship with the victim in order for the tribe to be able to prosecute. So there's still a long way to go, right? That's just part of the puzzle. But it was a step in the right direction, right? And it has given us a lot of hope. We've continued to fight in the courts as well. I got involved with this case 2 years ago called Dollar General versus Mississippi Choctaw, which was a case where this case involved a young boy who was victimized, a Choctaw boy, who was victimized by a white man who was the manager of a Dollar General store. The tribe was not able to prosecute him due to Olifant, but they were able, the family of the victim filed a civil lawsuit in tribal court for damages. This child had been placed at Dollar General to learn job skills, and he was victimized. So they sued Dollar General in tribal court, and Dollar General protested a jurisdiction all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So I got involved with a group of Native women. We filed an amicus brief with the court to make sure that the court understood how important this issue was and how important it was that tribes retain some civil jurisdiction, if not criminal, over cases like this. Fortunately, I would have preferred a win. We had 8 justices at the time the decision came out. So it was a 4-4 tie, which means that the lower court decision stands where the tribe was the victor. So it was a victory of sorts. We could have lost that case. It could have been very, very devastating to Indian country. But we hope that the voices of victims are the reason why the court, was in a stalemate there, and we consider it a victory. So those are just some of the stories I have to share with you this evening. I'm really inspired to be doing this work. It is tiring work, but it's also very invigorating work. So I really want to thank you for this opportunity, for reading my book, for being part of this event, and for inviting me here this evening. And I look forward to our conversation to continue tonight. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. Hi. Are you on too?
I'm on.
All right. My name is Kara Thompson, and I teach in the American Studies and English programs here at William & Mary, and it's such an incredible honor to share the stage with you, Professor Deere, and to have a conversation and be able to just kind of pick up on some of the points in your captivating talk and maybe extend beyond that as well. So I think I'm going to begin with sort of a quote from your book. It's short, but sure. So you write, "Over the past 20 years, I have spoken to hundreds of Native women who have survived rape or domestic violence, usually both, throughout Indian country, from remote Alaska villages to Indian communities in dense urban areas. Most of my scholarship and activism has been directed toward the need and rights of those survivors." So then you go on to describe how your work with Native survivors of rape began when you were an undergraduate at the University of Kansas, where you're now teaching. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between your advocacy and your activism and your scholarship, and sort of what is it meant for you to negotiate the boundaries, and we can talk about are there boundaries between your activism and your intellectual life?
Thank you for the question. I really appreciate it. So I guess I don't know if this is okay for me to say with my home institution, but I consider myself an activist first and a scholar second. I don't know if that's how they want me to present myself, but that's the truth. I was an activist long before I began teaching or writing, and that has been the driving force in all of my different jobs that I've had. I've worked for the federal government, I worked for a nonprofit, and then I started teaching about 9 years ago. And so in all of those capacities, I kept my activist hat on. And I think that for me, I want my scholarship to matter. I want the things that I write to not just be intellectually challenging, but also are designed to solve problems, right? That's just important to me, and because otherwise I wonder who's reading it and why. And so when I think about what I want to write and how I want to write it, I'm thinking about the end goal of making some sort of social justice change, whether that's a legal change, a social change, a cultural change, some shift that I hope will happen as a result of the things that I work on. So I don't see a clear, like, bright line rule that separates the two for me anyway.
What does knowledge mean then or constitute in the context of the work you do? So that might mean sort of your own or those with whom you work, how you educate yourself, how you educate your communities. I mean, thinking about like the relationship of, in the academy we talk about expertise, right? And sort of driving toward that. And clearly you have that as a lawyer, and so what does knowledge mean then, especially if you consider the fact that you don't see a kind of, sort of binary between your activism and your intellectual work. They're sort of bound up, so.
I think that's another great question. For me, I learned about all of these laws, these structures, these legal structures in law school, and I think I learned them well, and I think I was trained and taught well. But until I actually started going out to tribal communities on reservations, in remote Alaska villages, everywhere in between, was that there were so many nuances to how the law actually shakes down in the real world, and that most Native women who have gone through this process of trying to resolve a violent crime that's happened to them know more about the law than I ever learned in law school. High school dropouts who were telling me about Supreme Court cases I hadn't yet read. And so for me, and I wanted to give everyone an honorary law degree wherever I went, because they were teaching me the law that I didn't learn in law school. And so I really have tried to figure out the best way for me to be a lawyer and be an activist is to do a lot of listening and reflection on what I'm hearing and what I'm learning. Because the real experts in this legal quandary we find ourselves in are the people who have been most victimized by it. I can articulate, what a legal holding was in a case, but I don't really understand how that shakes down on the ground level until I've talked to somebody who has actually been the victim of that law or that case. And so I've really expanded my knowledge based on my outreach to communities, and I'm so grateful that people have been willing to share with me their experiences, because otherwise I could have not have developed this sort of comprehensive critique without their support.
Yeah, because you spoke very beautifully about sort of having to tell the story and narrate this history, and the story can be in law, and it can be in settler colonial histories and forms of brutality. But I think like what I'm hearing from you now is that also the story is in the survivors and stories of healing and things. So you said we don't need pity. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how to kind of think about, listening to these stories that are so devastating and brutal, and honoring the traumas that women have endured and survived and live with, and then on top of resiliency and resurgence and kind of moving forward.
Well, I think a lot of the foundation for my thinking about this came from when I was trained as a rape crisis advocate. And I worked as a rape crisis advocate for about 6 years, on and off, during undergraduate and law school. And I think the first lesson that I learned from my mentor, who was the director of the Rape Crisis Center, was that listening to someone's truth is an honor and a privilege, right? People will often say to me, how do you do sexual assault all day? Isn't it depressing? And certainly it's distressing, but I also find it incredibly hopeful and inspirational at the same time that somebody's trusting me to tell this story or to write this novel or to tell this, there's so much privilege in terms of sharing what you've learned. It's a privileged place to be. So for me, when I say we don't need pity, I think there's a tendency among people who haven't been exposed to issues that arise for Native people to feel a lot of guilt, to feel bad that they don't know this information, that they just haven't been exposed to it. And I think that that's a valid response. But that can't be the end, right? It can't be, oh, I feel very badly that I didn't know this history. It's not necessarily your fault, right? I mean, there's a lot of public school districts that just simply don't expose people to tribal issues, or if they do, they focus on the past and not necessarily the present. And so people haven't been at fault for not being exposed to this. But it's not enough to feel bad. I mean, if you want to be motivated to do something, it has to be, you have to move beyond that and understand that we don't need your pity. We're very strong people, right? We've subsisted and survived for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But now we need your help, because we only constitute 2% at most of the United States population. So if we need to move federal legislation, we can't do that. We don't have enough voices. So learning about this issue should also motivate you to think about doing something about this issue, because pity doesn't get us anything. What we need are people who are allies, who understand and care and can speak about these issues to people that they know, and their lawmakers, their representatives, if that is possible. So that's really important to me. I never wanted to, when I was a rape crisis counselor, I never wanted to pity the person that I was working with. That would not be a useful offer, a useful tool. But what I want to offer is empowerment and respect and dignity, because that was really what was going to move somebody to the next phase of their life. And that's all we're asking for, is dignity, really, at the end of the day.
This time last year, many of us were turning our attention to, or maybe even actually visiting, Standing Rock. And you know, witnessing the incredible Indigenous-led movement to oppose the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And one of the things that I think is, you know, maybe not spoken about enough is how the camps were established and kept by Native women and youth, but it was Native women, right? And so kind of thinking about this notion of, like, we're strong, right? And so I wondered if you could talk first, I mean, you could talk about that part of it, about making and keeping camp, but also maybe I was thinking about, what does it mean to think about Mini-Wachoni, you know, water is life, in terms of advocating for Native women and protecting them from the ongoing violences they endure as the result of settler colonialism. Because, you know, at the heart of this, I think, is a question about what is the relationship between land and sexual assault and rape that isn't just metaphorical, right, but that's systemic and structural.
Well, Standing Rock is sort of a pivotal moment, if you will, although it's not a moment, it's a place. And it's a place where people have lived for centuries and thousands, millennia. But it also is a moment. I think it really does sort of tip off the 21st century fight for Indigenous self-determination and sovereignty. And women have been at the center of that. But the interesting thing is, and we talked about this last night as well, is that Native women have been there for all of the major contemporary activism movements, from the development of AIM, the American Indian Movement, to Alcatraz, to Wounded Knee, the takeover of the Bureau of Indian Affairs building in 1972. But we kind of got overshadowed a bit by Native men in those spaces. And so what's been really fascinating is to see that out of the Standing Rock community that was developed, it was a community. It was not an activist camp. It was a place where people lived and had babies and went to school, and that moment was very, very sacred. But for the first time, it seemed like the mainstream press said, oh, there's women doing this stuff, rather than just focusing on the men. And the Two-Spirit LGBTQ community there also was very visible and very centered in that space. So it's a new, not necessarily new for Native people, but maybe for people from outside who always sort of thought about Indian warriors and civil rights people as men, as cisgendered, straight Native men. And now there's this new image that sort of has evolved. So the mainstream audience is looking at this community and seeing women at the front lines and seeing LGBTQ people at the front lines. And that's a very empowering place to be. But yes, the destruction of the environment and the sexual violence committed against people have a lot of the same sort of attributes. And structurally, they can be very similar in that people with power are making decisions about the land, and people with power are making decisions about the bodies, and they're not being considerate of either. And so they're the same philosophy, the same philosophical belief system can explain the environmental impact as well as the physical impact for Native women. And what we have seen is there's a literal connection as well, because when fracking occurs in North Dakota, for example, they have to bring in a lot of workers, a lot of people to do that work. And I'm not familiar with what all is involved with fracking, except that I get Oklahoma earthquakes in Kansas. And that is, I mean, seriously, like the fracking earthquakes in Oklahoma will reach Kansas all the time. And, but they have to bring in a lot of able-bodied young men who are almost all white. And they live there in these very small little trailer houses or in tents, really. They're shanty towns. And what we have come to understand is those are very dangerous places for Native women and children. Very dangerous. There have been reports of being drugged and raped repeatedly for weeks. Missing, people have gone missing. There's no accountability. The tribe can't do anything, right? And there's not really any other entity that can intercede and intervene. And so this has become a huge problem. So yes, there's the metaphor of raping Mother Earth and raping Native women, but there's also a very strong correlation between the activity that has to happen to exploit the land and the way that women are treated in that world.
So what does decolonization entail? This is an easy question, I know, but what does it entail? What does it look like? What are the sort of, I guess, horizons of it?
I'm glad you said horizons, because one of the things that tends to happen when we talk about decolonizing, whether we're talking about decolonizing the curriculum or the world or the people or the tribe, is that we tend to look backwards in time and say, well, what did we historically do? Which is something I did in my presentation, right? Is that, okay, so let's go back to tradition, right? Let's go backwards and try to recreate a world that we had prior to contact. Well, that's not going to happen. You know, I mean, there's a lot of things we can restore and revitalize, like our languages, but we're not going to live that life that we lived 500 or 600 years ago. So I think decolonization has to be focused on the future. And the future is to articulate for ourselves what we want in our communities, right? Not what the American system says we should want, not what the American legal system says is the right way to run a government, but our own vision for the future that's articulated through all kinds of mediums, you know, fiction, nonfiction, dance, song. There's so many ways to articulate what we want for our future, but that's really what has to be forward-looking to be meaningful to me.
I want to transition in just 1 minute to Q&A with our audience, but as a way to do that, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what we can learn from your work about sexual violence on campuses, right? And so kind of thinking about, you know, and again, I don't mean to make an analogy or anything, but just to think about, like, if we engage with your work, how can we translate some ideas and some of the provocations and some of the forms of hope and healing to thinking about campus life?
Well, there was this Tlingit elder that I met in Alaska who, you know, we were talking about these issues for like a 2 or 3 day workshop symposium, trying to articulate, you know, solutions to violence. And she put it quite simply to me, and that is, you don't mistreat things that you respect. You don't mistreat people you respect. And so for her, I mean, it really kind of distilled everything we've been talking about for days into this simple idea of respect. That if you respect somebody, that you don't violate them. If you respect someone, you don't want to harm them. You don't want to intercede and provide problems in their lives if you respect somebody. And so I think that has lessons outside of the tribal communities, right? When we think about why is sexual assault common on many college campuses. And I think that there's a lack of respect, right? Maybe it comes from the way somebody was raised, maybe it came from television and movies, there's all kinds of things that you could look at, but ultimately it has led to a lack of respect. And so we have to restore that. We have to find ways to encourage people to respect one another, respect boundaries, respect space, respect bodies, all of those kinds of different ways of respecting. And that, I think, will take us a long way. But also the issues that I brought up of hope and dignity are also applicable on college campuses, that not everybody wants to report the crime to the police and go through a prosecution. That doesn't mean that there's not a form of justice we can still offer them, because justice can mean really many different things to many different people. For some people it means I'm gonna go to a prosecutor and put him away. But most of the time that's not what survivors want. It's not a safe kind of place to think about being. So we have to offer that dignity, honor, and respect as a form of justice to the people who've experienced that kind of crime, because it can derail one's whole education, right? Women drop out of college all the time because they've been raped, and we can't keep losing people like that. And so we have to make sure that honor, dignity, and respect are part of any response to sexual violence on college campuses.
Well, thank you so much. So what I want to do now is let you have just a bit to sort of think about the last 40 minutes or so, and each of you should have an index card so you can ask questions in two different ways, right? So you can write your question, and we have people that will run those up to me. Obviously, and unfortunately, we won't get to every question. So I'm going to do my best to sort of think about where our conversation has gone and what we haven't talked about as I look through the questions. While you're doing that, I will invite you, though, if you would like and feel comfortable, to kind of hail one of the people with a microphone, and you can ask a question directly. Dean Tracy has them up here. You can ask a question directly to Professor Deere. Okay, so we'll just kind of transition here for a second.
Should just be a simple switch.
Is it on? Yep, it's on. Thank you so much for your talk. Part of the research that I'm doing personally right now has to do with concepts of race and concepts of indigeneity, and the way that the law really structures indigeneity in terms of race and how that can be a source of violence. I wonder if you have any insight on that. I'll leave it open-ended.
I think I don't know that I can sum up my thoughts on it in a quick way. I carry white privilege in all of aspects of my life, right? I don't look native to most people. I'm not mistreated because of the color of my skin. And so I walk in a very different world than my friends and relatives with brown skin. And I think I need to acknowledge that. I don't know what it's like to have brown skin in this world. I'm native, but I can't claim to understand and have experienced that level of racism and violence. But I do think that we have to be really thoughtful about race in our contemporary cultures, in our contemporary tribal nations. So I'm thinking in my experience, my tribe's experience with slavery, that the Creek Nation was one of many tribes that had chattel slavery in the mid-19th century. And anti-Black racism has continued as a current into the present day with my tribe's history. And so I think when we think about race and Indians, we have to have a very complicated conversation about skin color, about phenotype, and about African American political identity as Native, as members and citizens of our tribes. Because racism of any kind is violence at the end of the day. So thank you for the work you're doing.
Right here. Oh, up here. So yeah, I'm actually interested in this notion of dispossession And I'm glad part of this came up already when you were in the discussion about how the workers came to do the fracturing, and unfortunately led to this abuse of Native women. My question is, so in my research, I want to expand on our understanding of dispossession, and some scholars have already moved away from just how it affects the material forms of dispossession taken away from the land. And I would be interested to hear your thoughts on if we were to think about, especially for your focus area, sexual violence and dispossession, right? So earlier in the talk, you talked about how the sexual violence that we experience now is colonial. So if we can connect then the dispossession that happened as early as 16th, 17th century to this very form of very real actualized sexual violence, how might that expand on our understanding of dispossession? So just trying to grow that understanding, as in, because my argument is I want to move more than, so much more happened than someone losing their land. It's so much more multifaceted, so much more complex. So if you could talk about how sexual violence would factor into that.
Yeah, that's a great question about, dispossession is something that I think rape survivors experience. You've been dispossessed of your body. Somebody has made a decision about your body that is not yours. And so you've lost that possession, that sense of, this is my body, I own it, I decide what happens with it. Somebody has completely disregarded that. I'm glad you raised the issue of land, because a lot of people will think, well, what happened to Indians that was so bad was that we stole their land. And that is a bad thing. And the removals were bad. It was all brutal. But sexual violence was always there whenever those events happened. So when we talk about, for instance, the Trail of Tears, the Long Walk, any dispossession, any movement of Indian people, sexual violence was embedded in that experience, and we don't talk about that part. So I usually can go to an audience, and almost everyone has heard of the Trail of Tears, right? Well, it wasn't one Trail of Tears. It was dozens, hundreds of trails, and it was much more than tears. Right? If you go, and it's there in the history, you just go to missionary records in many places. And sexual violence was part of removal that was used as a tool to terrorize our communities so that we would be compliant with the removal. And so you can't talk about Indian history and dispossession without talking about rape. Thank you for the question.
I've got a question. It's Ashley again. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your talk and for your presentation. So a little bit of context, and they're not gonna like that I'm talking about this, but that's okay. I come from a tribal community where we were matrilineally focused. We totally had that kind of separation of duties, but an equal understanding of what women do and what men do. And unfortunately, over the past 400 years, dealing with colonial expansion, my community has adopted, the men in my community have adopted that understanding of a hierarchy, that men are up here and women are down here. For example, we just got the right to vote in our political, elections in 2012. Okay, so that's just a little bit of context. So I want to know, in your experiences with other Indigenous communities, if this kind of flip in gender dynamics because of colonial expansion has exacerbated any of this violence against Native women, that maybe their communities where women are not honored in the way that they were prior to European colonial expansion exacerbates any of the issues that you've come across?
That's a great question. Patriarchy has now taken root in many, many tribal communities. It's a European import. Certainly there are patrilineal tribes, and in many places the warriors were considered the most powerful people politically, largely men. But patriarchy, as we sort of know it right in this moment, how it affects us is a European import. And if we can label it as such, we can begin to dismantle it. Most traditional tribal people don't want to be European, Western-styled players, so you have to educate. Patriarchy is a European concept. Patriarchy as a systemic form of oppression is not part of our heritage. and reclaim the heritage. But not just to say we want to go back in time, right? Like I said earlier, it's like, yeah, in this moment we can talk about historical, traditional, but we also have to talk about what we want our nation to look like moving forward. It's not just that we want to go back to the way that women were treated with respect. We want to be treated with respect in the 21st century too. So we really have to make sure that when we're talking and educating folks about this issue, and trying to dismantle patriarchy that's taken hold, and my tribe is, we have a lot of times this comes with a heavy Christianization too, right? And so when we're trying to think about that, Christianity has traditionally been a patriarchal religion. I think a lot of people are working with the religion in new ways, but it traditionally was a patriarchal religion. So that has taken root as well. And so we have to talk about that. It doesn't mean that we're not Christians anymore, but we have to interrogate sort of what that gender negotiation has been as we become more and more Christianized over time. But it has to be forward-looking as well as backward-looking. Thanks.
One of the questions from on the cards was, what do Native men, where do Native men stand in the midst of sexual violence? In other words, what role do they play in ending it? And I just sort of wonder if it can kind of build on Ashley's comment and then in your response.
Thank you. Well, Native men are also victims of sexual violence at very high rates. LGBTQ two-spirit Native people are experiencing sexual violence at very high rates. We don't have as much data, but the data that we do have is quite alarming, right? So we have to open the discussion there. But I think it's incumbent upon Native men to make sure that they are playing a role in dismantling Western patriarchal values within our tribal nations, and building up this concept of respect for Native women. What I get a little nervous about is the idea that I don't want to critique really amazing work that's being done, but sometimes there's this kind of warriors honor women, and sort of a stereotype, right? That men are our protectors, that Native men are the warriors that are going to make sure that we're protected. And I'm not sure how helpful that really is in a contemporary setting. So I really want it to be more about respect and not protection. And that's the distinction that I would make around how Native men can support Native women in this work.
Since you mentioned Two-Spirit, one person asked about if you could speak a little bit more about the involvement of Two-Spirit and LGBTIQ community in sort of in the movement against violence against Native women.
That's a really important question. I think that, again, when we're talking about the way that patriarchy has taken hold in our communities, homophobia is largely a product of that same dynamic, right? That there's this conception that that heterosexuality is a mandate for everyone. And so Two-Spirit people, Native LGBTQ people have been marginalized and oppressed in many of our tribal nations. And again, my tribe is no exception to that. And so any conversation that we're having around patriarchy also is necessarily going to implicate our LGBTQ Two-Spirit relatives, who are often experiencing the brunt of the most kinds of violent oppression in our communities. But again, it's not about pity, right? So at Standing Rock, it was the Two-Spirit camp that became so prominent and led so many of the wonderful discussions and dialogue throughout the camp. And so we need to center Two-Spirit people within any of our activist communities, because it's sort of once you experience it, it's sort of a obvious vacuum when we don't ensure that they're centered with our communities.
I have so many good questions that I could keep going here from on the index cards, but I want to make sure if there's anyone, again, that wants to ask directly. Okay. What about, one person asked about kind of the room to think about recuperative justice and prison abolition, and in kind of the context that you're talking about. Could you speak to that?
So this is this is the question that that I sort of dread because I think I'm a carceral feminist. I'm not sure if that's allowed anymore. Here's the deal. So I believe that the Western American mass incarceration is based in racism, rooted in irrational fear, that basically jails are the new form of slavery, the new Jim Crow, if you will, right? That's an important book that you all should read if you haven't, The New Jim Crow. And so what do we do with bad people in tribal communities? Do we lock them up? Do we send them to a foreign system to get locked up? I mean, there are people that are dangerous. There are people that have been brutalizing, hundreds of victims for a very long time. And I struggle with the idea that we're going to invoke restorative justice in some of those cases. I'm not saying it can never work, right? But a lot of times restorative justice is about resolving a problem where both people have contributed to the problem. And it also fails to be a fact-finding. Restorative justice is not really set up to be fact-finding. You have to have someone who's sort of admitted guilt to be part of a restorative justice process. So somebody says, I never did it, I didn't touch her, I didn't do a thing, I'm innocent. What is restorative justice going to offer, right? This is not making me popular in a lot of my leftist circles, by the way. I'm not saying we need to lock up everybody, but I'm saying there are people that need to be separated from the community if they're too dangerous, or if they've hurt too many people and it's painful for those people to see that person around, right? Maybe we could conceive of some form of incapacitation that doesn't involve all of the trappings and drama and horrible ideology that underlie the American prison system. There are some people who are dangerous. What do we do with them? I'm not sure if I know the answer. I don't think locking up and throwing away the key is always going to solve the problem. But I think from a victim's perspective, we want to be safe in our own communities. And if there's somebody that's brutalized me and everyone I know, they might need to be away. And I'm not sure exactly what that means for every community.
Yeah, yes. Excuse me. My questions are just factual, and this may be totally my ignorance, but just a few pieces of information that I need to sort of better understand the context. One is, what is the legal argument? What are the legal arguments that are used to oppose, expanding the juristic authority of the tribal courts? Why this reluctance on the part of the federal government or whoever, that's number one. Also, can you say a little bit more about the kind of context where these encounters happen? So how do white people, where do they meet the Native women? And do you feel that these aggressors, are they aware of the legal leniency on these issues? Or if you can just shed a little bit more light on that, that would be great. Thank you.
They're really great questions. The first answer to the first one is that most people who oppose tribal jurisdiction do it for reasons that I would categorize as racist. They may not see themselves as racist, but they oppose tribal authority because they're concerned that tribes cannot function in a fair way, that tribes can't be fair to everyone that comes before their court systems. And the only reason that tribal courts could not be fair would be if we are morally inferior beings that cannot dispense justice in a fair way. So when people really talk about, I don't want their tribe to have authority here, you have to really interrogate what that's about. Sometimes they'll say, well, because I'm worried about, it's unconstitutional or something, which is what's thrown around a lot. And I will ask, well, what's unconstitutional about it? And usually they can't articulate anything particular about it. So it's really at the root about race. And then the second part of the question, I knew I was going to forget. Oh, so on most reservations in the United States, there are, with some substantial exceptions, there are more white people than Indian people on reservations. Though our land was chopped up through allotment and sold off to white people back in the turn of the last century. And so that's why white people have come to live on reservations. Now, there are some reservations where that's not true. And so the data we have is national data. We don't have local, regional kind of, specific data that explains what's happening in every location. It's just national. So there's probably dynamics that change depending on where you are. But white people live, and American Indian women are the most likely, according to the census, American Indian women are the most likely people in the United States to marry outside of their race.
I'm sorry, can I just ask a very quick
Sure.
follow-up question? So can you, if you face sexual violence, can you take the case to one of the non-tribal courts to prosecute it?
Right, so if a non-Indian commits an act of rape today on a reservation right now, this afternoon, this evening, and the tribe can't prosecute them because they don't have a jurisdiction, depending on the tribe, this is a whole semester, by the way, I'm summing it up in 2 sentences. Depending on the tribe, it could be either the federal or state government that would have authority in that case. But the problem is a foreign government, and the other problem is they don't do it. They have failed to do it. So now Native people are saying we have to restore that jurisdiction. We can do it on our own terms.
Someone asks here, what are the daily pleasures, experiences, or moments that keep you engaged or motivated to do the work you do? Just to kind of
You're not going to like my answer.
I'm excited.
I watch I'm being filmed, right? Okay. Well, I don't think this is a secret among my friends and family. I watch a lot of really bad television. I do. Yeah, I do. I would like to say I do yoga or, have some profound thing that I do to center myself. But the truth is, at the end of a long day, I watch Project Runway. I think it's an amazing show. I think Tim Gunn is brilliant. And you just have to have brain candy for yourself. And some people can use yoga and exercise and other forms of artistic expression. For me, I have to fill the head with silly stuff, right? And so bad television is like my savior, I think. And it may not work for everyone, but yoga doesn't work for me. So, you got to figure out what helps you. And also, I have a wonderful husband, and we have 2 dogs, and snuggling and walking, going on long walks is also a really big part of my life. So always take care of yourself. And I think the most important thing, I give advice to my law students as they're leaving law school, is that you have to find something every day that's going to make you laugh. You have to laugh once a day. You really, really do. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And it can be just a short little chuckle. There's this meme that I have that's a Siberian, I'm sorry, it's a Siberian husky photobombing a lab. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but every time I look at it, I start to giggle. And so I have that on my desktop. And I'm not kidding, you gotta do this. So you find something that just makes you crack up, and you put it on your desktop, and then when you start to get overwhelmed, you click on it, you laugh, it makes it easier to go on to the next thing.
A follow-up on the jurisdictional question a few minutes ago.
We'll get back to business.
Yeah. I think most of the audience was probably shocked with the 1-year maximum sentence for any kind of felon. You answer the question, I think, in terms of a non-resident of the reservation. But what happens if both the victim, and the perpetrator are on the reservation? Does the tribe in any instance waive jurisdiction and allow the victim to take a case outside of the courts, the tribal courts?
Well, there's concurrent authority. So if the situation is such that there's an Indian, a native defendant, then that case could go federal, could go state, could go tribal.
Who makes that decision?
Well, typically, victims don't really have the authority to file charges. That's something we kind of say, the victim didn't press charges. Technically, victims don't. It has to be the decision of that sovereign, that jurisdiction. So depending on who takes the case and who reports it and who takes the initial details down, that might be referred to tribal court, might be referred to state court or federal court, depending on the neighboring jurisdictional framework. So a victim doesn't necessarily have any choice about how the tribe or the state decide whether they're going to take it or whether they'll both take it. But I'm trying to encourage tribal leaders and tribal prosecutors to take the victims' wishes into account. And there are some victims in very, very small, isolated communities that would prefer that the tribe not be involved because everybody knows each other, everybody's related to each other, and it's just too painful. And so in those cases, if there is a neighboring government that will take the case seriously, and that's a better option, then that might be the way to go. And I think each case is a little different and each victim's a little different. I think what I'm most concerned about is that long-term safety and dignity of the victim.
I think in line with that, one of the questions here is, you mentioned a community cannot survive, let alone thrive with violent statistics. The violence, yeah, I knew I was gonna mess that word up, statistics like this. So how do women, Native women combat what seems like a devastating blow to the collective spirit? And then I'm going to ask one more, and I can remind you, because several people asked this question, so this is a kind of summary of how can non-natives, and I think both, white folks and people of color, you use the word allies, so I'll use that word, but sort of how can we be in a position that isn't about pity, right? So first, the first part of the question is about the sort of collective spirits of Native women and how do they combat the, this devastation, and then what can we do?
Well, I think, Native women have survived. We're still here. And there's things that we have done that have worked. And it may involve, our ceremonial ways. It may involve our spiritual beliefs. May involve Christianity, if that's the religion we've adopted. There's ways that people find solace, right? And healing, and that's different for every person. One of the things that's challenging is when you don't have access to your sacred sites, the places where your ancestors prayed, and because of removal or because of whatever devastation that's happened to those sites, you don't have access to them anymore. But those can be really powerful too. A lot of our spiritual ways are tied to land, and so we go to certain places to find healing. So I just think that we have an incredible fortitude generally, and that we have taken care of each other as best we can despite the circumstances. But we can't sustain it much longer. It's not possible to have a successful, thriving society when 80% of the women are victims. And so we've got to be done with this part of the chapter. And that takes us to the second question, right? Can you remind me what it was? Oh, the role of allies.
Yeah.
A lot of people say, what can I do? I think that social media is a great way to figure out what to do. And we didn't have it 10 years ago, and so you had to tell people to sign a petition or get on somebody's mailing list. But now social media shares quickly things that are happening that you can get involved in. So the Clearinghouse, I'm not affiliated officially with the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, but that's an organization that I know is leading the way in terms of the federal work that's being done. So if you're interested in following what's happening in Congress right now, there's been hearings, there's a lot of attention being given to missing and murdered Native women in the United States. It's the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. The acronym is NIWRC, and they have a website, Facebook page, Twitter, and they're working on all the legislation. So if they're working on a bill in Congress, right, they'll tweet that out, and then you can call your representatives and make sure they know that it's something they should pay attention to. And that's kind of the basic way to get started. But the ideal thing that you go is go to the indigenous people in your community and ask them what's needed. Would be the more difficult sometimes process for determining best course of action. But in the meantime, social media can get you a quick, instant way to know what's going on and how you can be supportive.
Well, I think I'm going to borrow from a comment here, which is, thank you for the work you do, you rock. So with that, I think, there's several wonderful questions you all posed here, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, but remember that there is a reception in Chesapeake A, right? I was listening, and so so please please feel welcome to attend that. And also that we do have copies of Professor Deere's book, The Beginning and the End of Rape, available. And so if you would like to speak with someone about that, you can look for people with the green name tags. So please let's thank again Professor Deere.